Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Adoption Show. I'm your host, Neha Smriti, Growth Marketing Manager at Fortfix. And today we are tackling a very big question. Why does most workplace learning still feel so forced? Think about it. Organizations are spending millions on courses, LMS platforms, and training programs, yet employees are still Googling their answers, turning to fellow colleagues, or figuring things out on their own. So, if the current L&D isn't working, what would? And that's exactly the question we plan to address today. And this is a discussion we are going to do with someone who has completely redefined how we think about learning. Nick Shackleton-Jones. He's the pioneer behind the courses to resources shift, creator of the Affective Context Model, and architect of the 5DI approach, all of which have challenged the way organizations design learning. With 30 plus years of experience at BBC, BP, Deloitte, PA Consulting, and much more, Nick has shaped L&D strategies for some of the world's biggest brands. He's also the author of How People Learn and a winner of the Learning and Performance Institutes Award for services to the learning industry. Today, we are getting into the big debates in it. So let's get into it. Nick, welcome to the show, and I'm really excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on here. I realize when you read those things out that it makes me sound incredibly boring. And I just wanted to reassure listeners that I always endeavor to be kind of quite exciting and provocative. So you're not about to hear from the least exciting HR person that you've ever listened to, hopefully.
No, not at all. And that's the reason we actually called you on the show as well. We wanted it to be very engaging, very exciting, and not at all boring for sure. Going ahead in that jam, and we have a fun segment. Again, not to make it too boring. So we have a fun segment of this or that. I'll have a quick
Mhm.
question. I'll give you two options to choose from, and you choose the option whichever fits best as per your personality. Cool?
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. So if you had to choose between fine dining or casual eats, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to really disappoint you both sometimes. You see, my wife likes fine dining, but sometimes I just like pizza. So we sort of do both, which I really like. So sometimes we do fine dining. So I would say if it's, I don't know if that's an option, but I'm going to go with both.
Right. Depending on whoever has more control that day, that moment of time.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. We share
Okay.
control.
City exploration or wilderness adventure? What would you choose?
Oh, they're doing it to me again because I do a lot of travel and I absolutely love travel. But I think maybe city. I do like the wilderness exploration. But if I had to track the percentage of time, I love spending time in, say, Warsaw, for example, or Eva, or so lots of. But and generally, I'm in the city, so I'm going to go city.
Perfect. Perfect. Even I'm not sure which one I would choose, but I think that's interesting. Okay. Cooking at home or eating out?
Eating out. I do most of the cooking at home, but I'm a really poor cook, so definitely going to go with the eating out.
That's actually nice. I love cooking at home, but I get lazy at times, so mostly eating out for me as well. Okay,
Yeah, very honest.
podcasts or audiobooks? I think both of them are audio medium, but again, both different mechanism of audio.
I'm going to break your format because I don't really do either. I like reading books. I don't really listen to audiobooks. I've tried both these things and I'm on a lot of podcasts. I even tried my own podcast, but it's not a format that works for me. And I find that fascinating that some people, that format, podcast format and audiobooks, they absolutely love it. Whereas for me, it just doesn't seem to work. I much prefer to watch video, TikTok a lot. So I use, but I don't do podcast or audiobook.
Okay, I think podcast will be for me because audiobooks, for some reason, it becomes very monotonous. So never works for me. At least podcast, you have two people engaging in a conversation, and plus we know what is coming out of it. So even I prefer reading a book. Okay, this is gonna be fun. Always being right or always being lucky.
Always being right or always being lucky. Oh, I think blimey, that's a good one. Lucky, maybe. I like serendipity. I like the idea that you have exciting experiences in your life and go on adventures. And so I think luckiness. I think always being right probably probably makes you quite
Yeah.
egocentric. So I think I would rather be lucky. How about you?
I think I'll go with probably always being lucky because like it's nice to be wrong at times and
Yeah,
challenged. So I think luck
yeah,
is something which we obviously can't control. Being right or wrong, at least we can control. So for me also,
yeah.
I think I'll go with always being lucky.
I'm
Okay.
sure you're right.
The final one in the list is being able to understand animals or being able to predict weather.
Being able to understand animals or predict the weather. Well, I think understand animals because I think predicting the weather With all the kind of the AI improvements and
Yeah.
whatever, it's getting something that you can do. Whereas understanding animals, I still think we're quite a way off. Although, interestingly, I've seen people trying to use AI to decipher things like whale language, which I think is fascinating. So maybe we'll be able to do that as well. But I think at this point in time, understand animals. I'm not sure what I would do with that power. Would I use it to like command a squirrel army? Because I quite like that. I might get giddy with power and actually, assemble an army
Yeah.
of devious rodents to attack corporate infrastructure or something. So
Yeah, you'll
yeah,
have your own Marvel army of little animals, squirrels and
yeah, a bit like
jobs.
Ant-Man, but with squirrels, Squirrel Man.
Perfect. Okay, it was a fun segment. I think you had fun with it. Let's dive into the heart of today's conversation, Nick. But before that, I remember you talking with the introduction that I gave. You felt like you come across like a boring person, which we don't want you to have. And we want
Be
our
boring. That's your advice. Don't be boring.
we want our listener to actually know the fun side and everything that you have been through in the 30 years of your journey. And we want to learn how has it been for you, where you started, how's it going now, what was certain turning points in your life which actually made you what you're today.
Wow. So, yes, very quickly, I started out as a psychology lecturer in Somerset. I studied philosophy and psychology, and I was passionate about those things. They don't lend themselves to a regular job. So, as I say, I ended up teaching psychology, HEFE level. I published some psychology textbooks along the way, which is kind of cool. And that got me to the attention of a startup. I went to work for a startup and then I worked for Siemens Communications in Milton Keynes. That was fascinating, shuttling backwards and forwards to Germany, and experiencing that sort of shifting cultures. And then I went from Siemens to the BBC. Wow, that was such a culture shock. BBC was so different. BBC, loads of creativity, but no money. And then I went from the BBC to BP. BP had loads of money, but not so much creativity. But what they did very well, you see, the BBC did creativity very well because everybody was competing to be more creative than everybody else. I think that drove creativity. Whereas BP, they didn't really understand creativity or the role it could play in the business, but they were great at delegation of authority. And in practice, what that meant was like anything up to $100,000, you didn't have to ask permission. You could just crack on and do it. And I learned that was a turning point to answer your question, because I learned the power of being enabled, of being given the space to deliver in a very specific way, which is delegation of authority. Saying, we trust you with up to this sort of value, you don't need to talk to anyone. And that enabled us to bring all these creative ideas to life, to do some genuinely kind of transformational stuff for the industry, to hire people who weren't the norm, people from different backgrounds, marketing and events and all kinds of stuff. And that was then a springboard going into consulting. I brought pretty much my whole team across, which is a whole story in itself. How do you do that? How do you take a whole team across from one organization into another? But consulting is a massive shift because you're selling. And so it taught me, I guess, that it's not enough to have a great idea. You also have to be able to connect that great idea to other people to be successful. And so I set up and led a service line at PA Consulting, worked with lots of amazing people, big pharma, United Nations, and then went to become chief learning officer. The title was actually something much more boring and long, but that's effectively what it was for Deloitte in the UK through the pandemic. My God, that was unbelievable. I joined the day before the pandemic, literally the day before the pandemic, which meant that I was the only person in the office. I thought it was going to be one job. It turned out to be an absolutely completely different job. It was super tough. I did 2 years of basically sitting in this room, thinking that that it would all stop at some point. And learned a lot, as you do from those sorts of roles. And then, end of story, last 3 and a bit years, I've been running my own company because I decided that I needed to design my own experience of life, and that just sitting in this room, like I was working in a contact center, wasn't the experience that I wanted. So I said, look, I'm going to have to take the plunge. I am not one of these incredibly annoying entrepreneur types, gung ho about start your own business. I did it somewhat reluctantly, but it's all seems to be working out very well. Worked with lots of wonderful organizations, and the variety and the sheer exploration, I guess, and adventure has been fantastic. So that's where I am today. Oh, also published a book called How People Learn along the way. I'm not plugging the book, just that was a turning point, really, publishing that book, I think. So that's a potted history. That's if your life flashes before your eyes before you die. That's basically.
That's actually amazing. We can never know how it has been for a person unless they start telling their own stories. So, yeah, that actually brought us to how you started from being in psychology to changing companies. And during different companies, you had so much experience, which has shaped the L&D leader we are talking to today. So, that's actually exciting. When you got into the corporate learning, you talk about a career in psychology. Do you think it anywhere shaped how you devise the whole learning, or how you have seen the whole learning paradigm change, or how you use it in your own learning?
So I'm going to tell you a story, which was I used to teach, amongst other things, kind of learning theory. So I used to teach Piaget, Vygotsky, Bruner, scaffolding, all this kind of stuff, social learning, behaviorism, observational learning, all of that sort of stuff, Skinner, Bandura. And what I was not seeing, because I was around at the birth of the internet. So I was there when the first web pages came up. I couldn't see anybody in the world, essentially, who was applying all of what we knew about psychology and integrating it with technology. There were people who knew about technology, people who knew about psychology, very few people working at the intersection of the two. So I thought I can be that person. And when I went to Siemens and hired a team, I guess my ambition was to use everything I knew about learning theory and human psychology to create the next evolution of learning, sort of super learning, if you like, using technology. And so at the time, I was reading people like Roger Schank, Professor Roger Schank, as he was, the late Professor Roger Schank. We later became friends and worked together on a number of projects. And I had this feeling that if we applied what we knew about human psychology, we could massively accelerate the effectiveness of technology. So we did exactly that. We applied all kinds of things, and it doesn't work. That's what I learned. So we learned this experimentally. We created a version of digital learning, differentiating it in using an independent measures design into kind of 4 or 5 different formats, everything from plain text all the way up to super interactive, story-driven learning, whatever. And then we gave groups of people the same amount of time to work with those different formats and tested their recall. And it made absolutely no difference. In fact, the people with the text format learned slightly more. And that was a watershed moment for me because it made me realize we have not yet really begun to understand learning. If you apply all of what we know, which is what people are doing with instructional design, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't work. What do you mean it doesn't work? People will learn just as much if they're motivated from a text document. We should know this because that's what people are doing with Google. There's no instructional design on Google. You hit a problem, you go to Google, you get the answer, you learn something. And actually, people avoid formats with instructional design in if they're given a choice. So for me, it was a watershed because I realized we hadn't really started. We hadn't really understood what was going on with people's learning, and that I needed to be able to set aside all of this volumes of kind of theory and whatever around learning and actually say, no, let's start again. We need to find a solid foundation.
Great. Like you said, I assume that it's gonna be we implemented learning science and we changed the whole nature of how we see learning, and it was completely different for you. It was like we got to know this doesn't work. These are the things we think would work because we are talking about science, we are talking about lots of research, but it doesn't work for learners. And it also brings it to how it has always, it keeps on evolving, it keeps on changing. So we have to evolve with the learners and what are their motivation and what are their triggers. So that's actually pretty nice because you worked in so many industries and you have seen different learning cultures, and you have also developed learning for different cultures and different orgs and different industries. If you can talk about certain challenges that you have seen which learners face or these companies have faced, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think you do. Everybody learns a lot through the challenges that they face. And working for different organizations, and especially working in consulting, where in the course of 2 years, it feels like you've learned as much as you would in 10 years in another organization, I think have really accelerated my understanding of what happens. And so I'm really grateful for the different organizations. But there are common problems. And a big part of my consulting business now is talking to organizations about those common problems. One of those, for example, is learning culture. So many organizations have this problem that they buy all of this learning content, they have a learning management system, and very quickly they start to see that nobody's using the learning management system, nobody's using the content libraries, and they say, oh, we have a problem with our learning culture, our learners aren't self-directed or whatever it is. What I learned is that's a blame the victim type response, that really, if people aren't using your learning stuff, that's feedback for you. And
Yeah.
generally, the core problem there is that the learning isn't relevant. It's not that people aren't learning, they are learning aggressively. They are learning every day, and they learn by, in the old ways, right? By watching each other, what they're doing, by trying things out. How do I do this? How do I book expenses? Talking to each other. They learn by looking things up. I'm going to Google it, off they go. We have not connected what we're doing in learning to the stuff that they care about. And we haven't done it in a way which makes it super accessible and digestible for them at the point of need. So, as I say, we're on this kind of journey of self-discovery and learning, and these problems come about because we haven't yet figured out how to do learning. We're lumbered with a set of rituals which are more or less dysfunctional, and we're just struggling to let go of those because we like what we know.
That's actually true. Coming to another one, I went through your profile and I saw that the courses to resources concept that you had coined when you were in BP, if I'm not wrong, which has actually transformed how we have seen L&D evolve and everything. Can you explain this particular philosophy to our listeners and what was the reason behind the shift and how do you actually implement it?
I can. I'm going to hesitate because the stuff that I say now, I have to be super careful because I'll tell you why. Because I was surprised at how courses to resources took off. It took off because it's three words and it rhymes, which is funny, right? Because essentially, courses to resources is not a new idea. There are people, some of them friends of mine, people like Guy Wallace, Bob Mosher, Kathy Moore, who've been doing performance consulting and performance support for decades, and people before them. In fact, it goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. There is evidence that the ancient Egyptians used checklists to make jobs easier for some people to do. And this had been summarized in a lovely book called The Checklist Manifesto by a surgeon called Atul Gawande. And what Atul found was that he was trying to improve or reduce mortality rates, improve surgical outcomes in a medical context. And what he discovered was that a single checklist, a single one-page checklist, had more impact on those outcomes than 2 weeks of training. And so he wrote this book about it and other applications of this. And the basic idea is that you can eliminate learning and achieve better performance outcomes. Now, many people struggle with that concept because they think of resources as learning resources. Resources are not learning resources, they're learning elimination resources. When I use the underground map to get around the underground, it prevents me having to learn the routes. If I take a shopping list to the supermarket, it prevents me from having to memorize 50 items, but my performance improves. So the idea behind resources, not courses, is that for many of the performance problems in organizations, the best way to get the best result as effectively and quickly as possible is to give people a useful resource, something that is easy for them to access, which enables them to get the job done without having to learn, right? But there's a problem. There is a problem, which is that's one of two things you can do. If you work in L&D, you can eliminate learning to get people to perform better, or you can build their capability, which is effectively experience design. Building capability is about getting people to practice something, and you have to know when to do which, because if you're getting somebody to ride a bike, for example, you have to give them an experience. You have to give them a chance to practice. You can't just give them a checklist. And if you're getting leaders to negotiate better, you can't negotiate or have a difficult conversation by following a checklist. So sometimes you need to build an experience, and sometimes you need to build a resource. The problem was that I had was that became so popular, that courses to resources or resources not courses, that people started to just, I know a couple of organizations eliminated all of the training whatsoever. And I was like, okay, look, I can see why you would do that, but you also need to build people's capability as well. And it doesn't automatically happen. I'm going to say this once more because maybe if you build resources, they don't automatically level up people's capability. In fact, in many cases, they will strip out that capability. So you just need to know when to do which.
That's true. Otherwise, people or companies would just be going, okay, our leader need to negotiate better. Here's a checklist of things. Thanks for the clarification. Because my next question was going to be, how do you start it? How do you make that shift from for a company? And plus, you have already covered. There's a belief that resources alone are very passive way of learning. So you have to build capabilities and you have to see where resources actually work and where these courses would actually define learners how they do their learning.
Yes, let me answer that because a lot of people will say, well, we followed your advice, Nick, and we built lots of resources and nobody's using them. And there are always only two reasons why that happens. One is they're not really resources, are they? Because sometimes I go and look at them. They're just modules. It's
Yeah,
like, hang on, it's not a resource. It's not a resource unless it's the most useful thing in that context. So the underground map is a good example because the underground map of the London Underground is the most useful thing that you can have in that context. A module on the London Underground, somewhere on the London Underground site, is not actually a useful resource. So a lot of times L&D people, as I say, they can't let go of this idea of modules and content when they design resources. I'll give a real example. We built a very successful induction program at BP, and the most downloaded thing was a checklist. And actually, every time I built an induction program, that is the most popular thing. Why? It's because it's boring, right? A checklist is super boring. But when you join, you are really unconfident. You really don't want to screw up. And so actually having a checklist is a really helpful thing. So that's one reason is that the things that L&D people create and think of resources are not really resources. And the other is sometimes they bury them. I'll say to an organization, that's interesting. Where did you put your resources? And they'll say, well, we put them in this part of the LMS or this part of a SharePoint. And then my reaction is, oh, right. So how do I access those resources on my phone? And they're like, well, you can't. You'd have to have single sign-on, and we don't allow mobile. And it's like, okay, so I think I see the problem. So those are two kind of common problems that organizations have. To your point around passive, they're not passive in the sense that Google, you might say, is passive. But the point is, I know I'm driven to use it. When I have a problem, I can go very quickly on the device that I find helpful and useful and get the answer. And that's what resources should be.
true. And the whole idea behind building these resources was to bring in more efficiency. And if you're not even able to access it, that's just cutting down on the efficiency aspect of it. So actually, that
Yeah.
answers the question. Okay, you have always emphasized that learning is always emotional. It's you talked about how it's experience driven and it's not just based on information retention. So coming to the affective context model that
Mhm.
you have talked about a lot. So we just want to understand, and if you could just break down this whole model, and why do you think emotions play a crucial role in learning?
Well, I don't think emotions play a crucial role in learning. I think emotions are learning. I think this is something that I struggle to get across. And congratulations, by the way, on correctly naming the affective context model. It's people keep saying you need to come up with a catchier name. Maybe.
What do people usually use instead of affective context model?
Well, you see, the thing is that people remembered resources, not courses, because it's simple and it rhymes. An effective context model is like three words that people don't like. So I've been toying with the idea of coming up with something more like bumper stickery
More
for it.
mnemonic, like all the first letters would be same.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. I'll work on that. Thank you. But here's the thing. I'm going to try and frame what I'm saying in a way which sort of brings it to life. Imagine that you travel back in time, like 300 years ago. And this is a time where people believed that you had a body and you had a soul, and that your soul inhabited the body. And imagine you tried to say to people, look, you don't have a soul, it's all body. They would laugh at you. They would say, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Of course, I have a soul. Who do you think is talking to you now? If I didn't have a soul, I'd just be an empty shell. And they would absolutely reject this idea that you don't have these two different separate kind of things, a body and a soul. And it would be almost impossible to prise people's fingers away from that dualism, as it was called philosophically. But one thing that would possibly give the game away, tell you that there was something wrong, is that when you said, well, do you think animals have bodies and souls? They would say, not sure. And people like Rene Descartes believed that animals were just mere mechanisms, as an example. We're in the same position now with reason and emotion. people and respectable scientists actually believe that we have separate parts of the brain for reason and emotion. And what I've argued in How People Learn is that this is ridiculous. This is just some crazy superstition. You literally do not think. René Descartes was wrong when he said, I think, therefore I am, because you don't think. You certainly have cognition, certainly neurons are firing and wiring. All of that is emotional activity. Everything that goes on in your brain is affective activity. For example, people are familiar with Kahneman, system 1, system 2. You don't have a reasoning area, system 2, and an emotional instinctive area, system 1. You have two different kinds of emotional areas. So one emotional area says, I want to eat that donut. And the other emotional area says, yeah, but think about how you'll feel later if you did, or think about how you're going to look on the beach on holiday or something. So it projects your feelings into hypothetical situations. So this is what makes human beings human, is that they have an instinctive, immediate, like most animals do, reactive emotional system, but they also have an emotional system which is hypothetical. And those two things are balanced against each other. We absolutely do not think. We have never thought. So what happens? How do you apply that to learning? Well, the way that memory works is that as you go through life, you have emotional reactions to different experiences. If you have no emotional reaction to an experience, you have a word for that: boring. And what do we know about boring stuff? It's forgotten. So we know that people are cognitive misers. We know from people like Elizabeth Loftus that memory is reconstructive. What do we reconstruct from? So the answer is, as you experience things, as you listen to this podcast, you have emotional reactions to certain things. You store those emotional reactions, and then you reconstruct a memory, which is why memory is reconstructive, from your sentiments, from your feelings. So all learning is affective. It's not that emotions are important to learning or whatever. All you can only learn via emotions. In learning, I'll say it different ways. Learning is just the process of storing your emotional reactions to things. Now, you can have emotional reactions to words on a screen. Typically, those are not very strong, but you can have emotional reactions to what you observe. If somebody gets burned on something, you have an emotional reaction to that. And if it happens to you personally, then for sure, which is the value of, say, simulators or in-person training. And so learning is this process of creating experiences that people have an emotional reaction to, which subsequently changes their behavior. It really is as simple as that. So yeah, it's a point which nobody is really going to start to agree with until I'm dead. And I think part of my career has just been coming to terms with that and being lighthearted about it. Because if I just get terribly frustrated, then I just become this grumpy old geezer that nobody wants to talk to. But I can assure you that is the answer. And for people who think that just sounds mind-blowing, that's why I wrote How People Learn, because to persuade you more deeply of that and to use a kind of more evidence-based approach to the argument rather than just the rhetorical one I've used here requires quite a few pages.
And can you share like few, so even in the process of learning, how can teams or L&D leaders trigger certain emotions that will help people maybe regain that whole learning effectively and more efficiently? If you have any examples there to share.
Yeah, because that's a really good question. I'm grateful because when people hear what I'm saying now, they think, oh, well, that sounds really weird, like creating training courses which are about emotions. It's not at all. Let me reassure you, it has lots of similarities with what you're doing today. Because the first thing is that performance support is about understanding what people care about and giving them stuff that they want. If your washing machine breaks down, all of a sudden you care about that. That's why you go to Google. So the first thing that you can do is talk to your participants, talk to your audience, really carefully catalog day to day. What are you worried about? I don't know, booking holiday. Right, let's create a resource on that. Like hitting my targets. Okay, let's create some resources that will help you do that. Resources, creating PowerPoints, building better relations with my clients, negotiating in a procurement role. If you find out what people care about, you know where their emotions already are, right? That's why TikTok works. People say, why are people addicted to TikTok? It's because it feeds you stuff you care about. So if we wanted to be really good at what we do, the starting point would be find out what people care about. That's why performance support works. But the second kind of thing that we have to do in learning is make people care about something they don't already care about. That might be diversity inclusion, it might be safety, as it was in BP, it might be data protection or information security, it might be innovation. And there, what we have to do is build new cares. We have to give them an experience which changes them. I'll give you a good example. We developed a leadership program for a big aircraft engine manufacturer, and we discovered in our analysis that their leaders, because they were very technical, they weren't very good at handling conflict or confrontation. And so we kicked the whole program off with a fight. They were sitting there, two facilitators came up who they just thought were two regular facilitators, and almost immediately they started arguing about the slides. Johnny said to Mark, this slide isn't supposed to be in there. Mark said, yes, it is. You told me it was. And this escalates to the point where one pushes the other. Everybody's gripping the edges of their seats, thinking, this is terrible. This is crazy. What's happening? And then we can stop the action and say, what did you notice there? Why didn't you step in? What stopped you stepping in? What should you have said? When should you have said it? Now let's try it. In case this sounds wild, I had the privilege of working with a guy called Jim Weatherby, who captained more NASA missions than anybody else. And I remember him saying, you can tell that a simulator is working because it makes you sweat. This is the basis of learning. Either we care already, so we grab stuff from Google, or we don't care, so we need somebody to make us feel something, to care about something we didn't before.
This is different from the line of questioning that we're having, because you have mentioned TikTok and how people
Yeah.
use it. Uh, we use Instagrams and we see reels and this sort of form of content. And we also talk about doom scrolling, which has come into picture. Like people just keep on scrolling through reels and reels after reels and
Yeah.
TikToks. These apps are built in a way to trigger that kind of emotion where you're not actively thinking but passively just doing something. It's just the algorithm. So is this like a responsibility for us to create learning which matches how people now resonate with these apps, or is it becomes our responsibility to pull them out of that?
Well, it's a source of shame to me, and I guess it should be to the industry, that marketing does what we do much better than we do it. So marketing is all about changing behaviors, typically buying behaviors, and they're not lumbered with the baggage. So we're lumbered in L&D. A lot of what we do in L&D is just tradition, and it's a religion. It's like a religious tradition, literally. When education was being formulated as a format, and people just looked at, what do you do in religion? Well, you get people together in a room, and an authority reads a book to them. And the reason that doesn't work is that the emotion that hinges on is authoritarian, basically, is respect. It hinges on the idea that, look, if a person thinks this person is so important that everything that they say it has a big emotional reaction in me, that might work a little bit. But as people like Eric Mazur have discovered through their research, typically it doesn't work at all. In fact, it's incredibly poor. And it's because it's an authoritarian model, right? It's like you care so much about this person standing in front of you. Who is this person? Just some odd bot from L&D? Why should I hang on every word? But if it's Barack Obama and you deeply respect him, now you remember every word, and it's a transformational experience for you. Do you get it? Do you get how emotion plays into that?
Yeah,
So
true.
it's really kind of interesting. And so, yeah, it's what marketing have done with TikTok, and what TikTok does is it figures out what you care about very quickly, whether you know it or not. So if all you want to see is people dancing, it sees that, because it sees that you watch that and you linger and whatever, and it feeds you more. So people say, well, it's a waste of time. You made it a waste of time. I like to watch videos about AI and philosophy and whatever. The internet is what you make it. The algorithm simply says, oh, I can see you care about that because you spent more of your attention on that. I'm going to give you more. So it effectively does what we should be able to do in learning much more efficiently. But your question is a good one, which is, do we have some moral, ethical duty? And we do. A big part of our role is getting people to care about things that they don't today. And there's a simple model for doing that. And it's the same model. It's an unbreakable model, which is, if you want somebody to care about something new, you have to link it to something old. This is how you train dogs to salivate at the sound of bells. A dog doesn't care about a bell, but if you link it to food, they start to care. How do you use that in educational context? Well, you say, look, if you don't operate in this way as a leader, let's say it's inclusively, your engagement of your team and your retention of them is going to drop quite dramatically, and they're going to go elsewhere. And in doing that, what you've done is you've said, this thing that you don't currently care about actually relates very closely to something you do care about. And again, people try to do this with, for example, sustainability. Think about your children and their future. Think about what you're doing today. So that, I think you're right. I think we do have that responsibility beyond what TikTok does, which is just feed you more of what you like. It's a funny thing because actually TikTok is quite good at this. I'm interested in magnet fishing. Do you use TikTok at all?
No, TikTok is banned in our country, by the way.
Oh, of course, I remember. I was in India last year, and I remember people telling me that. So
It
thanks
got
for it's inescapable. Yeah, effectively, just because it's really effective from a marketing standpoint. One thing I do like about TikTok, and it's distinct, I think, from some of the other things like YouTube, whatever, is it feeds you odd stuff, serendipitous stuff. You asked me at the beginning, luck. So I stumble across stuff in TikTok because of the way the algorithm works. A certain percentage of stuff is things that you wouldn't normally be interested in, like magnet fishing. Magnet fishing is like people who they go and they stand on bridges with a big magnet on a piece of string and they drop it in. And you can find yourself, I'm currently fascinated by this lady, I think in Denmark, who's discovered a German bunker in her garden. And she is digging this thing and she's posting day by day. She's digging this thing up. I can't wait to see what it looks
what
like. So it's like, it's also quite good at developing you in new directions. But I don't think it's done in a very mindful way, if you like. But I do think it does quite an interesting job of that.
like in India, I remember when TikTok was banned, there were so many underprivileged people who had internet and had phones. They were
Mm.
using it to just have fun. So when you
Yeah,
see those videos, it's quite inspiring because these are the people who don't have the means, but
yeah.
they still were having fun with it. So it actually brings you to a lot of other context and other people and experiences, which you might not know if you're just not using it.
So I guess we look at things like that and we think that they're fun or frivolous because we don't understand them. We're so used to this idea of education being an authoritarian sort of transaction that people say, well, that's just nonsense. But if you look at young people and their use of it, what they're doing is they're learning aggressively about what matters to them. And for young people, that's typically how to fit in, how to be cool, what's on trend, what's not. And if you think, what's the relevance of that to L&D? The same process, the same motivations drive people when they join your organization. So you'll find that when new starters come into an organization, their number one concern is fitting in. That's what, and so what they want to know is, what language do I use? Create a jargon buster, as we did at BP. How should I dress? I spent a lot of time interviewing new consultants to Deloitte, and they said that was a major concern of theirs. How should I dress? Short videos. This is how I dress in these different contexts.
Yeah.
What's normal? What's cool? What's admired? So again, we've just failed in L&D to really understand how learning works and what drives learning. And I think that's why we have to start with a kind of a firm foundation and just stop carrying on with all the kind of the silly rituals.
That's true. I wanted to also speak about the 5DI model because it brought a great shift in human-centered
Yeah.
design, learning design, and it moved from the traditional frameworks like ADDIE. If you can talk about how does this model challenge and improve upon the established instructional design frameworks and models in terms of user experience, performance, business alignment, and so on.
Yeah. I've got a question for you first, though, Neha, which is, do you ever make sandwiches?
Yeah.
Do you use the time model when you make sandwiches?
I
No? You
like
see,
that.
you just make them, yeah. You see, I'm a professional sandwich maker and I use the time model. And the time model is think about the ingredients, make the sandwich, and then eat it. And that's what makes my sandwiches so much better. Now, if I said that to you, you would say, I think that just sounds like nonsense. I think that's just like a made up thing. And I think that's what we've done in learning with Addy. I'm really sorry because I think Addy is basically, yeah, think about the problem, design a solution, and then evaluate it. It's like, how would that not be common sense? I don't think it tells you anything useful. If somebody said, how do I build this bridge? And you said, well, use this model, have a look at the problem, design a solution, build a bridge, and then see if it stands up. I think you'd say, I don't think that's told me anything new. And I think the reason that we've done that with learning is that we're desperate to look as if we have some kind of a model. Now, when I did a lot of critique, I did a very comprehensive critique of Addy based around that kind of concern. A lot of people jumped to its defense and they said, I understand what you're saying, Nick, but I've built in this and I've built in and bolted on that. And I've added in this design principle or this approach, or somebody said design thinking. I've added design thinking. And I was like, well, jolly good. But that's the problem, isn't it? Now you've got an organization where everybody is doing whatever the heck they want under the umbrella of ADDIE, because
Right.
ADDIE doesn't preclude you from doing anything. It's just like something that you say to give the impression of having some system around what you're doing. As I say, there was a really comprehensive kind of critique of ADDIE that I published, but the basic problem with it is it's not based on anything. It's just a kind of a common sense framework that enables people to do everything. And within an organization, as I discovered in some of the organization I was in, that's deeply problematic because you've got the Wild West. You've got everybody doing what they like. You've got people running along the beach with tambourines. You've got somebody else over there working with third parties, somebody else over there doing something completely different, lecture. And every one of them, when you say, why are you doing that? They say, we're using ADDIE. So 5DI is a human-centered design approach. Human-centered design obviously isn't something that I invented. The basic idea is if you were developing a product, then it's not a bad idea to talk to your customers. This is how product design works. If you're developing a new kettle, you want to sell more kettles, you talk to your customers about what they like, what they don't like, price points, all this kind of stuff. And you design something that fits with their needs. It's obvious, really. And there's a guy called Don Norman who wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things, which is a great read. But the problem is, why haven't we been doing this in learning? Why haven't we been talking to people about what problems they face in their work before we design learning programs? Well, the answer is that's not how school works. You didn't go to school and have somebody say, oh, day one, what are you interested in? What challenges do you face day to day? What are you trying to achieve with your life? We're going to design a learning program that meets with your needs. You go to school, there's a curriculum, there's topics, and somebody lectures at you. It's grossly ineffective, monstrously. It's so ineffective. You would probably class it as torture on any other planet. But we carry on with it because that's the tradition, right? So in a lot of organizations, the way that L&D works is you toddle along to a stakeholder. The stakeholder says, we've got some content. Content needs to go in the course. You build a course, you give it to people, you force them to complete it, has almost no impact on the organization whatsoever. And we just carry on. We rinse and repeat. One of the people on one of my programs referred to it as potato land. Other people have referred to it as order taking. And if you work in L&D, you'll discover that you start to suffer from this at some point. This feeling that you're just being told to put content in courses, and this really sinking feeling that you're not making a difference. So what is 5DI? 5DI is a way out of that problem. It's a way to do two things: deliver stuff which learners actually use and has an impact. And secondly, to demonstrate a return on investment for the business on the stuff that you do, those two problems. And it solves those problems by doing two radical things. Number one, define, talk to the business about what are the behaviors and things that should change. So just be clear on what it is that you're trying to do. Don't talk to them about content and topics. You're dead in the water. If your conversation has already gone down that route of talking about content and topics, forget it. It's over, game over. You're wasting your time. Talk to the business about how will people be thinking and feeling and behaving differently. That's number one. Number two is now go and talk to your audience about what they care about. Because if you're going to have any hope at changing their performance, you're either doing experience design or you're doing performance support. And both of those things depend on an understanding of what your audience cares about. And then there's define, discover, design. There's design, develop, deploy, and iterate. There's a free toolkit. Again, absolutely not promoting or plugging that because it's free. But because I would like the industry to develop and grow, the 5DI toolkit is a huge, I think there's something like 50 odd kind of resources in there that anybody can use and download, and lots of organizations already are.
That's actually nice. You were talking about the steps in the 5DI model, and
Yeah.
you about how it actually brings the return on investment, which is a topic everybody wants to understand deeply. How do you actually show learning impact? How do you use this model to, I think that it's the evaluate step. How do you actually use it to show the impact of your learning or the ROI of your learning initiative?
It's super easy. It's always been super easy. There's never been any real challenge in measuring return on investment. The problem has been that we haven't done stuff which delivers a return on investment. Do you get what I'm saying? It's like, imagine that you're part of a feng shui team. And if you're not familiar with feng shui, it's a mystical art of moving things around in a room to improve the
Yeah.
energy. And imagine that you're a group of 12 people in an organization who every year travel around and they readjust little bits and the seating in rooms. And somebody senior says to you, how can you demonstrate the ROI on this activity? And you say, well, it's very complicated. You have to understand the difference between correlation and causation. And it's not complicated, actually. It's really straightforward. It's just that what you're doing has no ROI. So in the industry, we have preferred to have this conversation about how difficult it is to measure ROI than to acknowledge that what we're doing does not have an ROI. You get my point? So I guess that the answer to your question is in the divine stage, you say to the business, how will people be behaving, doing things measurably differently as a result of this program? And the business tells you, and then you go off and you measure them at the end. So somebody might say, we would like our induction program to improve people's confidence. We would like our induction program to improve retention. We would like our consultants, their utilization to be better. We would like to reduce the time to getting onto the first client project. And you say, okay, so thank you. That's what we're going to work on. We're not going to put content in. We're not going to talk about topics. You're going to tell us what you would like to see happening differently in the business and how you measure that today. And then we're going to go off and we're either going to measure that or we're going to see the metrics change. And there's your return on investment. It's super straightforward. It's just that we have gone down this route of putting content in programs and then scratching our heads about why it doesn't make an impact. So that is how you do it in the divine stage. You rigorously catalog the behavior change and the measurements that you've got. Now, the only fly in the ointment is that sometimes the business will say, well, we don't track that. We don't want to pay for somebody to track that. But there will usually be some kind of metric like retention in the case of induction programs, or the staff engagement survey in the case of leadership programs, where you can see some of the impacts of a program. So yeah, that I think is the answer.
Basically, it's not how you measure it, but you have to firstly define in the first, second stage itself. And then the whole ROI will just start coming in smoothly.
It sounds crazy, doesn't it, when you put it like that? But
Yeah.
designing a sales program where the head of sales says we need a program for new salespeople, and you say, oh, all right, what content needs to go in the course? And they say a little bit of this, a negotiation, whatever. And then you deliver all the content. You're like, oh, we can't really see any impact. It's like, where did you go wrong along the way? Did you not think to start by saying, oh, what should happen if this program is a success? Will they be selling more stuff, different stuff? Will they be staying longer? It is really pretty straightforward. I think it's about asking the right questions at the very beginning.
That's true. Okay, this brings me to the last question. Let's say today, if you had to redesign the corporate L&D from scratch, for you, what would it look like with the shift towards learning the flow of work and evolution of upskilling, reskilling, and so much coming in? What would your ideal L&D strategy look like if you had to develop it from scratch?
Okay, I'll do my best. So my dad was an engineer. I quite like engines, although I didn't go into engineering. But you can imagine your L&D department as an engine with sort of two components to it. One is the creation of resources, and the other is the creation of experiences. Now, if you think about learning in your life or in the lives of anybody in your organization, that is the basic engine that drives learning. People hit a problem at work, they join your organization, they think, well, I don't know how to book leave, or I don't know how to claim expenses. That challenge causes them to pull on resources, which they then use to develop themselves. So it's this simple combination of experiences, typically challenging experiences, and resources. The resource might be the person standing next to you, by the way, or it might be a checklist or something. And that is how people are learning today. So when you create an L&D department, you say, we're going to accelerate that process, either by creating more resources that help people with the problems they've got, or by creating more challenges that help people develop capability in new directions. So you start with two teams, a performance support team an experienced design team. But now your engine is just standalone. It needs then to be connected to the business. So it needs a steering wheel, if you like. So now you need somebody who is going to maybe business partners or learning partners or consultants who are going to have the right conversations with the business to understand, where are you trying to head? And then the other side of it, if you like, the wheels, you have to connect it to what really matters, the friction points for people every day. So now you've got two sides to it. You've got your engine, experiences and resources in the middle. And then you've got people who are talking to the business and understand the requirements. And then maybe the same people talking to that two side of it. And then you've got operations. So you're operationalizing those experiences and resources. Now it's starting to look like it works. And then you've got to have some governance on the top. So a little bit of steerage overall, like which are the priorities, and then beneath it, you've got to have some kind of impact measurement. So in the case of Deloitte, for example, setting up the team, I established Tom, who was basically head of impact measurement. And he was the person who was looking across the different business measures and metrics to make sure that when we create a leadership program comprised of experiences and performance support, that we can actually measure the impact of that program. So at its very basic level, I know it gets more complex. You've got two teams of people, one who are good at creating really high impact experiences, another who are really good at creating performance support, typically digitally, and you're connecting those to your stakeholders and to your audiences. You've got a bit of governance at the top and some impact measurement beneath it. And that's what it looks like. That's the basic model. I think one question which I thought you were going to ask, but maybe I'll be rude and answer anyway. Is what's the role of AI in all of this? Yeah. AI, if that's how you understand learning, can do one of two things. It can either be performance support, which is a little bit like sat nav in your car, which is as you're working, it can say, oh, here's a useful thing to know, or here's a useful person to connect to. So it's like Google on steroids. So that's good, AI sort of performance support. Or the other thing it can do is experience design. And you might think, how on earth does AI do experience design? Coaches, good example. It's like practice this conversation with a difficult conversation with an employee, or practice this difficult conversation with a customer or a client, this negotiation, let's say. So AI can be used effectively in two ways. One is performance support, the other is experience design. But what I have to say, and this is so important, almost every AI application on the market that I see at the moment is just churning out chocolate teapots more cheaply, is garbage, because they're just focusing on the old educational agenda, which is how can we feed content into the AI hopper and have it spit out a module that nobody wants and nobody needs and nobody will complete. And so sadly, because of this infection, this kind of toxic effect, if you like, of education, a lot of AI is pointed in the wrong direction. That is to say, just churning out more content that people don't need to fill these already disused content libraries. But if you think about AI in terms of performance support and experience design, you can do something that's useful, I think.
And like you said, I spoke to so many people in the past, how is an AI gonna transform it? And they're like, currently it's more of a content creation, content generation itself, and not adding a lot of value to what it has the potential of. So yeah, you captured pretty nicely there.
Thank you.
Perfect. I must say this was an amazing conversation. The examples you have shared resonated so nicely. So thanks a lot. Thanks for coming to the show as well. To all our listeners, don't forget to subscribe to the Digital Options Show. It's present on all the podcasting channels, your favorite ones, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get to see or listen to your podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, like, share, and leave us a review. I'm your host, Neha Sri, signing off. Until next time, keep learning and keep evolving. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.